The moment Elvira Hart rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, with nothing but a battered carpetbag, a loaded derringer tucked into her boot, and a deed to a piece of land she had never laid eyes on, she knew her life was about to change in ways she could not yet begin to imagine. It was the spring of 1878, and the land was wide and unforgiving, stretching out in every direction beneath a sky so enormous and blue that it made a person feel both free and terrifyingly small at the same time. Dusty Creek was not much of a town by any standard. There was a general store, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a church that leaned slightly to the left as if it had given up arguing with the Texas wind. A few scattered homes sat at the edges of the main road, and beyond those, the open range spread out like an ocean of dry grass and possibility. Elvira was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of creek water in the shade, a kind of gray-green that shifted depending on the light and her mood. She was not a delicate woman. Her hands were capable, her posture straight, and there was a steadiness to the way she moved that suggested she had been through enough in her short life to know that falling apart was a luxury she could rarely afford. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of fever 2 years prior and left her with nothing but his books and his principles. Her mother had passed when Elvira was 12. She had no siblings, no relatives willing to help, and very few options. The deed to the land in Dusty Creek had come to her through her father's old friend, a man named Horace Becker who had died intestate, and through some odd miracle of legal circumstance that Elvira did not fully understand, left the property to the only person who had written to him faithfully in his final years, Elvira herself. She had written those letters because she was lonely and because her father had always said that writing letters was the truest form of human connection. She had not expected anything in return. Life, she had learned, rarely gave you what you expected, though occasionally it surprised you entirely. She dismounted in front of the general store, tied her horse to the post, and walked inside with the deed folded in the pocket of her riding skirt. The store smelled of coffee and tobacco and dried beans, and an older woman with silver hair and reading spectacles perched on her nose looked up from behind the counter with open curiosity. "You must be new," the woman said. "I am," Elvira replied. "My name is Elvira Hart. I have a deed to a parcel of land about 3 miles east of town. The Becker property. I am trying to find out who I should speak with about getting started on it." The woman's expression shifted into something more complicated. She set down the ledger she had been writing in and folded her hands on the counter. "Horace Becker's old place," she said slowly. "Child, that land has been sitting idle for going on 3 years. Nobody wanted to touch it after what happened." Elvira felt something tighten in her chest. What happened? The woman, who introduced herself as Ruth Galloway, and who turned out to be one of the most forthright people in the territory, told her plainly that the Becker land sat right on the edge of territory, that a cattle baron named Silas Drummond had been trying to acquire for the better part of 2 years. Drummond owned a large spread to the north and had been systematically buying, or, when buying failed, pressuring the smaller landowners off their properties. Horace Becker had refused to sell right up until his death, and more than a few people in Dusty Creek suspected that his final illness had been helped along by Drummond's particular brand of persuasion, though no one had ever been able to prove a thing. "There are people who will not be happy to see you take up that deed," Ruth said, watching Elvira carefully. "And there is only one person in this county who has stood up to Drummond and lived to tell it with anything worth telling." "Who is that?" Elvira asked. Ruth tilted her head toward the window that looked out onto the main road. "Martin Rhodes," she said. "He has a ranch about 4 miles south of here. He has been ranching this valley since he was 19 years old and he is now 31. Drummond has tried everything short of burning him out and Martin is still standing. If you need advice or an ally, he is your man." Elvira thanked her, bought a few supplies she could afford on her thin budget, and stepped back out into the afternoon sun, turning Ruth's words over in her mind. She had not come to Dusty Creek looking for trouble or for allies. She had come because it was the only option available to her, and because something in her had always wanted to plant her feet somewhere and say, "This is mine, and I am staying." She was not sure yet what kind of trouble was waiting for her, but she had not ridden 3 days on horseback to turn around and go home to nothing. She found out where Martin Rhodes lived from the livery stable owner, a quiet man named Pete who pointed east and south, and gave her a set of directions that involved a particular dead cottonwood tree and a dry creek bed that ran south in a U-shape before straightening out. She took note of it for later and spent her first night in Dusty Creek in the room above the saloon that Ruth helped her arrange, lying on a narrow bed with the Texas wind pushing at the window shutters and thinking about what she was going to do with a piece of land she had never seen. She rode out to the Becker property the next morning at first light, and what she found was discouraging but not impossible. The small farmhouse was still standing, though it had suffered from 3 years of neglect. The roof needed patching in at least 2 places, the front porch boards had rotted through in several spots, and the well casing had cracked enough that it would need to be inspected before she trusted the water. But the land itself was good. She could see that. The soil was dark where the morning light hit it, and there was a natural spring about 100 yards to the east that Horace Becker had noted in a letter once, saying it was the best water in the county. A stand of cottonwoods marked where the spring ran into a shallow creek, and the grass in the lower field was thick and green even this early in the season. She walked every acre she could manage that morning, and by the time the sun was high overhead, she had made her decision. She was going to make this work. She was heading back toward the house when she heard hoofbeats on the road that ran along the north edge of the property, and she turned to see 3 riders coming toward her at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried in the way that things are when people want you to see them coming and feel the weight of their approach. The man in the middle was broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache and the kind of clothes that cost money, a well-cut vest and new boots that had no business looking that clean in this country. His 2 companions were hard-faced men who wore their guns low on their hips in a way that was purely functional. The lead man reined his horse at the fence line and looked down at Elvira with an expression that was almost pleasant. "You must be the new owner," he said. "I am," Elvira said. She kept her voice calm and her hands visible and her eyes steady. "Name's Silas Drummond," he said. "I own the property north of here. I have been hoping to purchase this parcel for some time now. I would be prepared to make you a very fair offer, more than the land is worth, truthfully, given its current condition." "It is not for sale," Elvira said. Drummond smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had nothing warm behind it. "You have not even heard the number yet." "The number does not change my answer," she said. "This land belonged to Horace Becker, and he left it to me, and I intend to work it. I am not interested in selling." There was a silence that stretched out between them, filled with the sound of the wind and the distant call of a meadowlark. One of Drummond's men shifted in his saddle. Drummond himself kept his eyes on her for a long moment before nodding slowly, as if he were filing some information away for later use. "You think about it," he said pleasantly, "and when you change your mind, you know where to find me." He turned his horse and rode back north, and his 2 men followed, and Elvira stood at the fence line watching them go with her heart beating a little faster than she would have liked, but her feet planted firmly in the dry Texas grass. She went to find Martin Rhodes that same afternoon. She almost missed the ranch entirely because the dead cottonwood Pete had described had fallen over since he had last given those directions. But she found the dry creek and followed it south, and eventually came to a well-kept spread with a solid 2-story ranch house, a large barn, several working paddocks, and a cookfire going near a smaller building that might have been a bunkhouse. The property had the look of a place that had been built carefully and maintained with real intention. The fence posts were straight, the paddock gates hung evenly, and the horses in the near field were healthy and well fed. She dismounted at the gate and called out, and after a moment a man came around from the side of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth and squinting at her in the afternoon light. Martin Rhodes was not what she had expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall and lean in the way of men who work outdoors in hard country, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a deep, steady brown. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was capable of real warmth even though his expression right now was careful and assessing. He was wearing worn work trousers, a blue flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, and boots that had seen a great deal of honest use. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was low and even. "I hope so," Elvira said. "My name is Elvira Hart. I have taken possession of the Becker property east of town." Ruth Galloway at the general store suggested I come speak with you. Something shifted in his expression when she mentioned the Becker property. He came forward and opened the gate, gesturing for her to come through. "You had better come in," he said. "I will put some coffee on." The inside of the ranch house was spare but comfortable. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a long wooden table with 6 chairs, shelves of practical things and a few books, and a window over the sink that looked out onto the east pasture. Martin set a battered coffee pot on the iron stove while Elvira sat at the table and told him about Drummond's visit that morning, about what she had found at the Becker property, and about her situation in full. She was not a woman who wasted time on half-explanations when a direct one would do better. Martin listened without interrupting, which she noticed and appreciated. He set a tin cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across the table and listened to the rest of it. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, turning his own cup between his palms. "Drummond is a serious problem," he said. "He is not going to take no for a permanent answer without more than words behind it." "I am aware of that," Elvira said. "I am not asking anyone to fight my battles. I am asking for information, and whatever practical help might be fairly offered between neighbors. I have enough money to keep myself for about 4 months if I am careful. I need to get the house sound enough to live in, the well tested, and a start on a kitchen garden before the real summer heat sets in. After that, I need a way to generate income from the land, and I need to know the terrain well enough to protect myself." Martin looked at her steadily. "Most people who have come up against Drummond either sold or left," he said. "You understand what you are choosing." "I understand," she said. "Do you regret not selling to him?" Something like fire moved briefly through his brown eyes. "Not for a single day," he said. She smiled for the first time since arriving in Dusty Creek, and he seemed slightly surprised by it, as if he had not been expecting the way it changed her face. "Then we understand each other," she said. They talked for another hour, and Martin told her things about the Becker land that proved useful, including the fact that the well casing had been repaired once before, and where the crack was most likely to be, and that there was a section of south fence that Drummond's men had knocked down twice in the past 2 years, ostensibly to let stray cattle through. He told her about the county sheriff, a man named Aldrich who was technically neutral but who tended to find reasons to be busy whenever Drummond's name came up. He told her about 2 other ranchers in the valley, the Pina family to the south, and an older man named Grady Walsh to the west, who had held their ground against Drummond and who might be willing to be friendly. When Elvira finally stood to leave, Martin walked her out to where her horse was tied and stood by the gate while she mounted. "There is a loose board on the east side of the barn roof at the Becker place," he said. "I noticed it the last time I rode by. I could come help you fix it Saturday if you like." "Barn's no good to you with a bad roof." She looked down at him from the saddle. The late afternoon light was turning the hills golden behind him, and the wind had come up enough to move the grass in long, slow waves. "I would appreciate that," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Rhodes." "Martin," he said. "Elvira," she replied, and rode back toward town with the distinct feeling that something had begun. She spent the rest of the week making the farmhouse livable. She slept at the saloon the first 2 nights while she worked on the most critical repairs, buying materials from the general store on a careful budget and learning, through a combination of stubbornness and her father's habit of teaching her that no skill was unworthy of a person's attention, how to patch a roof and reset a porch board. Ruth Galloway turned out to be a valuable source of both supplies and local knowledge, and she extended Elvira a line of credit at the store with a practicality that felt like genuine kindness. By Thursday, she had the house sealed against rain, the worst of the porch repaired, and the well inspected by an old man in town named Cooper, who said the casing was cracked but patchable, and the water itself was clean and good. She moved her things into the farmhouse on Thursday evening, lying that night in Horace Becker's old bedroom with the windows open and the night sounds of the Texas spring coming through, the crickets and the frogs from the spring creek and the distant howl of something wild and free on the hills. And she felt, for the first time in years, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Martin arrived on Saturday morning with tools and an extra set of hands in the form of a young ranch hand named Tomás who worked for him, and who was 17 and mostly silent, but extraordinarily competent. They worked through the morning on the barn roof, and Elvira worked alongside them, handing up materials and holding boards in place and learning as she went. Martin moved with an efficiency that suggested he had fixed 100 roofs over his life, and he explained what he was doing without making her feel talked down to, which she noticed. Around noon they stopped for water and the cold biscuits and dried beef that Elvira had prepared, sitting in the shade of the barn's west wall with the spring breeze finding them. "You are more capable than most people who come out here expecting land to be a gift," Martin said, not unkindly. "My father raised me to be practical," she said. "He said sentiment without skill was just wishful thinking. He sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was," she said simply. There was a silence that was comfortable rather than awkward, which was unusual in her experience with people she had known for less than a week. "How did you come to be here?" she asked. "Ruth said you have been ranching this valley since you were 19. Martin took a long drink of water before answering. "I came out from Tennessee with my uncle when I was 15, he said. He had land here that he'd been granted after the war. I worked his ranch until I was old enough to go out on my own, and I found this piece of ground and bought it on credit and paid off every cent over 8 years of honest work." He paused. "My uncle died 4 years ago. My folks are back in Tennessee. I do not see them often. Are you lonely out here?" she asked, and then immediately felt that it was perhaps too direct a question for a second real conversation. But Martin did not seem offended. He looked out at the grass and the sky for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "this country can make a man feel very alone if he lets himself think about it too much. I try to keep myself busy enough that it does not get a full grip." She understood that perfectly. She did not say so, but she thought he could see that she did. Drummond's men rode past the property twice that afternoon at a distance close enough to be deliberate, but not close enough to provide any legitimate cause for complaint. Martin watched them the second time with eyes that went flat and hard, and Elvira felt the weight of the confrontation ahead like a change in the weather. "He is going to do more than ride by," Martin said quietly, when Tomás had gone to retrieve a dropped tool on the far side of the barn. "I know," Elvira said. "You should know that the fence on the north boundary is your legal line," Martin said, "and any cattle that come through it onto your land, you have the legal right to hold them. Drummond has been using the fence-breaking trick to claim encroachment going the other direction, saying the small landowner's animals got into his fields. It is backward, but the sheriff has let him use it twice." "I do not have cattle yet," Elvira said. "No," Martin said, "but you will if you are staying. A few head to start. I can help you with that too." She looked at him. He was watching the horizon where Drummond's riders had disappeared, and his profile in the afternoon light was strong and quiet, and something in her chest moved in a way she recognized and immediately set aside, because she had more pressing concerns and she was a practical woman. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed between them that was natural and uncomplicated on the surface and increasingly complex underneath. Martin came to help with the larger repairs and tasks once or twice a week, always with a practical purpose, always accomplishing real work. Elvira, in turn, rode over to his place to help when she could, understanding instinctively that what he was offering was neighborly help, and that it would diminish rather than honor it to simply receive without giving back. She helped mend fence on his south pasture one afternoon and helped with the branding in late May, learning the work quickly and keeping pace with the hands in a way that earned her quiet respect. She met the Pina family in April, when Rosa Pina came to call with a pot of stew and two of her children, who had the kind of unself-conscious friendliness that came from being raised in a house full of warmth. Rosa was 10 years older than Elvira and had been fighting Drummond's encroachments for 3 years since her husband Emilio had died of a riding accident, and she had a practical ferocity about her that Elvira found immediately admirable. They became friends quickly and honestly, the kind of friends that women in isolated country become when they recognize in each other the particular combination of capability and loneliness that the frontier produced. The trouble with Drummond escalated in May. It began with the north fence, which was cut clean in 3 places one night, and a dozen of Drummond's cattle pushed through onto Elvira's land. She found them in the morning, and instead of panicking, she rounded them up herself on horseback, penned them in her barn paddock, and rode to town to file a written complaint with the county clerk, bypassing Sheriff Aldrich entirely on the advice Martin had given her. She then sent a formal note to Drummond requesting payment for the use of her land and pasture, calculated at the going rate for grazing lease. The response came 2 days later in the form of Drummond himself riding up to her front gate with 4 men behind him, and a smile on his face that did not reach his eyes. "You are holding my cattle," he said. "I am," she said, standing on her repaired porch with her hands at her sides and her voice steady. "They were on my property without my permission following the destruction of my fence, which I have documented with the county clerk. You may have your animals back upon payment of the grazing and impoundment fee, which is legally established at $2 per head per day. You have 14 head and they have been on my property for 3 days. That is $84. Drummond stared at her. One of his men made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "You are a troublesome woman," Drummond said flatly, the pleasantness entirely gone from his voice. "I'm a legal landowner protecting my property," Elvira said. "I have documentation. You may go to the county clerk and confirm it yourself. The alternative is that I contact the regional land office in Fort Worth, which has jurisdiction over grazing disputes of this nature, and we can let them sort it out. I understand they have been looking for examples of improper land pressure in this county for about a year now." She did not entirely know if that last part was true, but Rosa had mentioned something to that effect once, and it was worth the gamble. Drummond's expression did something complex. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded set of bills and held them out to one of his men, who rode forward and held them out to Elvira without comment. She took them, counted them without looking like she was counting them, and nodded. "Your cattle are in the south paddock," she said. "The gate is around the east side of the barn." Drummond turned and rode away without another word, and Elvira went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and let her hands shake for exactly 2 minutes before she put the money in the tin box under the floorboard and went back to work. She told Martin about it that evening when he rode over to check on her after hearing through the Pina Ranch that Drummond had paid her a visit. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened to the whole story, and when she was done, he looked at her with an expression she could not quite name but that made her feel simultaneously seen and unsettled. "That was brilliantly handled," he said. "I was terrified," she admitted. "It did not show," he said. "I have had a lot of practice at not letting things show," she said, and something in her tone made him quiet for a moment. "That sounds like it cost you something," he said carefully. She looked at him. Outside, the evening was turning the color of amber and rose, and the frogs in the spring creek had started their dusk chorus. "It does sometimes," she said, "but I would rather be capable and lonely than helpless and surrounded." "Those are not the only two choices," Martin said quietly. She looked at him again, more carefully this time, and found him watching her with those steady brown eyes that gave nothing away easily, but that, when you paid attention, gave away a great deal. She changed the subject, and he let her, and they talked about practical things until the dark came fully down, and he said good night and rode home. And Elvira sat by the window for a long time after, watching the stars come out over the Texas dark, thinking thoughts she had not let herself think in a long while. June arrived with heat and thunderstorms that rolled across the plains in tremendous dramatic sweeps, turning the sky green-black and filling the air with the smell of rain on hot earth. The spring flooded briefly after one particularly fierce storm, which Elvira managed by digging a diversion channel on the east side of the house that kept the water from the foundation, a project she had started 2 weeks earlier on Martin's advice. She had 4 chickens by then, bought from Rose's surplus, and a kitchen garden that was coming along better than she had dared hope. She had also acquired, through a carefully negotiated trade with Martin that involved her doing 2 weeks of mending for his ranch hands in exchange for the animals, 2 young cattle, a heifer and a young bull, which was a start toward the small herd she needed. The mending arrangement had produced unexpected intimacy. She had ridden over to Martin's ranch 3 evenings a week for 2 weeks, sitting at his kitchen table with a basket of shirts and work trousers, while Martin did the ranch accounts at the other end of the table, and they talked. They talked about everything. About the land and the weather and the cattle market prices and the news coming out of Austin. About their lives before Texas. About books they had read and opinions they had formed. About the particular philosophy required to build something in country that could take it away from you at any time without apology. She discovered that he had read more than she would have guessed, that he had opinions about politics that were thoughtful and unsentimental, and that he could make her laugh with an observation so dry and precisely aimed that it took her a moment to catch it. He discovered, she thought, that she was not easy to shock and not easy to frighten, and that she had a capacity for real engagement that went beyond the practical, that underneath the capable exterior there was a mind that was quick and curious and hungry for conversation. There was one evening in the 3rd week of June, during a thunderstorm that had rolled in fast enough to catch Martin on the road home, when he ended up staying at the farmhouse rather than riding through lightning on an open road. Elvira made supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and they ate by the light of the oil lamp while the storm hammered at the windows and the thunder rolled across the hills in waves. After supper they sat by the fireplace, because the rain had brought a chill, and Martin told her about the summer he had turned 19 and gone out alone to find the piece of ground he wanted to build his life on, how he had ridden for 10 days through country that was beautiful and indifferent, and how he had found the valley and known immediately, in the way that you sometimes knew things before you could explain them, that it was his. "I thought I was the luckiest man alive," he said. "And then the work started and I found out that luck does not build fences or calve heifers or fix well casings." "No," she said, smiling, "it does not." He looked at her in the firelight, and she was aware of the specific quality of the silence between them, the way it had shifted over the past weeks from comfortable to charged without any single moment she could point to as the cause. "Elvira," he said, and her name in his voice sounded different than it did in other people's voices. "Yes," she said, which was not really an answer to anything, but he seemed to understand it anyway. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, just held it, his thumb moving once lightly across her knuckles, and she let him, and they stayed like that while the storm finished its work outside and moved on east, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it that night. He rode home in the clearing rain just after midnight, and she stood on the porch and watched the lantern on his saddle grow smaller in the dark, and she thought that she was in a great deal of trouble, and that it was exactly the right kind. In July, Drummond made his next move, and it was less civilized than the cattle incident. He challenged the deed itself, filing a claim with the county that the property had never been properly transferred after Becker's death, and was therefore still part of the estate, which by some legal contortion he had a competing interest in through a loan agreement Becker had supposedly signed. The claim was thin, and when Elvira read the documentation, she could see the places where the dates did not quite line up and where the signatures had a quality that made her suspect. But thin claims filed in the right courthouse could tie up a property for months, and months was time she did not have. She wrote immediately to the land office in Fort Worth, providing a full accounting of the situation and copies of all her documentation, and then she went to see a lawyer. The only lawyer in Dusty Creek was a young man named Herbert Crane who had come out from Philadelphia 2 years ago, and who was inexperienced but honest and brighter than his youth suggested. He read everything she gave him and said he believed the challenge was fraudulent and that he could fight it, but that he needed money for the filing fees and the research required. She had $80 in the tin box under the floorboard. She gave Herbert 60 of it and hoped the kitchen garden and the chickens and the careful management of what remained would be enough to carry her through. Martin came over when she told him what had happened, and he was angry in a quiet way that was more concerning than loud anger. He sat at her kitchen table and read through Drummond's claim and the documentation twice, and then he looked up at her with an expression that made her feel, for just a moment, that she did not have to carry this alone. "He is overreaching," Martin said. "He is doing it because it has worked before, because people got scared and sold rather than fight the legal process. But this documentation is genuinely weak. Crane should be able to take it apart." "I know," Elvira said. "I am not frightened of the legal fight. I am worried about the money and the time." Martin was quiet for a moment. "I can lend you money if you need it," he said carefully. "I want you to understand that I say that simply as a neighbor and a friend without strings attached. I know you do not like to owe anyone." She looked at him across the table, and something softened in her chest that she usually kept armored. "I know you mean it simply," she said, "and I appreciate it more than I know how to say. I am going to try to manage without it, but I will tell you if I cannot." He nodded. "That is all I ask." "Martin," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for this, for all of it, for showing up with tools and information and patience. I want you to know that I see it. I do not take it for granted." He was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he was feeling something he was not sure how to put words to. "I come because I want to," he said finally. "There is nowhere I would rather be." The words landed between them with a weight that exceeded their simplicity, and Elvira felt color come to her face and did not try to hide it. The legal challenge moved through the summer slowly and frustratingly. Herbert Crane was methodical and determined, and by August he had found enough inconsistencies in Drummond's loan documentation to file a counter-challenge. Elvira received a letter from the Fort Worth land office in August saying that they had opened a formal inquiry into land practices in Drum County, and that her complaint had been registered, which was both encouraging and not immediately useful. Through all of it, the work of the land continued because it had to. Elvira harvested her kitchen garden and put up preserves and dried vegetables with Rosa's help, learning the preserving methods that Rosa had been practicing for years, and that represented a genuine transfer of knowledge between women in the way of the frontier, practical and generous and essential. Her 2 cattle were healthy. She had added 4 more chickens and was selling eggs at the general store in town, which provided a small but reliable income. And Martin was there, consistently and warmly, in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to interpret as purely neighborly. He brought her wild plums in late July that he had found along the creek south of his property, carrying them in his hat because he had not brought a bag, and when he handed them over, He looked slightly embarrassed by the gesture in a way that she found entirely endearing. He stayed late one August evening helping her fix the kitchen chimney that had developed a smoke problem. And when they were done, they were both covered in soot and laughing about it. And he had reached out and wiped a streak of black from her cheek with his thumb. And the touch had lasted a moment longer than the practical task required. And when their eyes met, neither of them looked away. It was Rosa who finally said what Elvira had been thinking around in circles for 2 months. They were sitting on Rosa's porch in the early evening of a cooler August day, shelling beans and watching Rosa's children chase fireflies in the yard, when Rosa set down her bowl and looked at Elvira with the direct gaze of a woman who had seen enough of life to have no patience for unnecessary waiting. "That man is in love with you," Rosa said pleasantly. Elvira did not pretend not to know which man. "I think you may be right," she said carefully. "And you?" Rosa said. Elvira shelled 3 beans before answering. "I think I have been in love with him for about 6 weeks," she said, "and have been trying very hard not to be, for a variety of reasons that seem less compelling every time I examine them." Rosa smiled with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been watching something develop that everyone around it could see except the 2 people inside it. "The reasons," Rosa said. "Tell me," Elvira sighed. "I am not settled yet. The legal situation is unresolved. I do not want to need anyone before I have proven to myself that I can stand on my own. I came here to build a life independently, and I am afraid of what it means to let someone into the middle of that before it is complete." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "Emilio and I married when I had nothing and he had less," she said. "We built everything together. There was no safe moment to begin. There never is for people who have come from hard things." She paused. "Being loved well is not weakness, Elvira. It is not the opposite of independence. It is something else entirely." Elvira looked at her friend in the fading light and felt the truth of it settle into her like water into dry ground. "I know," she said quietly. "I think I have known for a while." She rode home thinking about Martin, about the way he listened, and the way he made her feel both capable and cared for, which she had not believed could coexist until recently. About the plums in the hat and the stroke of his thumb across her cheek, and the particular quality of the silence between them, which had always felt like ease and was becoming something more than ease. She did not say anything to him immediately, because she was not a woman who moved without thinking, but something shifted in how she was with him, something that he seemed to notice and that he moved toward carefully, the way you move toward something that startles easily, not wanting to rush it. It was a September morning that changed things finally and entirely. She had ridden out early to check the north fence, which she did regularly given Drummond's history with it, and she found Martin already there, having evidently had the same thought. He was on horseback along the fence line, and he turned when he heard her coming and raised a hand in greeting, and the early light was behind him, and the dew was still on the grass, and she thought that she had never seen anything so simply beautiful in her life, and she was not, she realized, thinking about the landscape. She reined her horse beside his and they sat together for a moment looking at the fence, which was intact, and the morning, which was extraordinary. "All clear," he said. "Yes," she said. They rode slowly along the fence line together and then back across the field toward the house, not saying much, and when they reached the gate to the yard, they both dismounted and she turned to him and said, without having planned it, "Martin, I need to tell you something." He looked at her with those honest brown eyes and waited. "I have been thinking," she said, "for quite some time about how much you have come to mean to me. And I have been making it complicated in my head, for reasons that I thought were about independence and practicality and timing, and I think I have been wrong about all of it." She took a breath. "I care for you very much. I believe I am falling in love with you if I have not already done it entirely, which I suspect I have." Martin was very still for a moment, the way a person is still when something they have been hoping for comes true before they have quite finished hoping for it. "Elvira," he said. He said her name like it was something he had been saving. "You can say something," she said, and her voice came out slightly unsteady in a way she immediately forgave herself for. He stepped forward and took both her hands and held them, and he looked at her with everything he had been keeping careful for weeks, and she could see it clearly now, all of it, the warmth and the depth and the wanting. "I have been in love with you since the day you told Drummond your land was not for sale," he said. "I was riding past on the road and I saw you standing at the fence line looking up at him, and I thought, that woman is something remarkable, and then I thought I would like to spend the rest of my life knowing her." She laughed, which came out a little shaky, and he squeezed her hands. "You saw that," she said. "I was halfway to town and I turned around," he said. Ruth Galloway looked at me like she was not surprised to see me. Elvira laughed again, more freely this time, and then she stepped forward and he let go of her hands and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt, with her whole body, what it was to be held by someone who knew her and chose her anyway. The morning was warm and full of light, and the horses waited patiently at the gate, and somewhere in the cottonwoods the birds were making a considerable noise about the day. He kissed her forehead, and then she looked up at him, and he kissed her properly, and the Texas sky above them was impossibly wide and blue. The legal situation resolved itself more fully in October, when Herbert Crane produced a witness, an old man who had been present when the supposed loan agreement was signed, and who testified in a written affidavit, carefully notarized, that the document he had seen was substantially different from the one Drummond had filed. The affidavit was enough, combined with the land office inquiry, to collapse Drummond's challenge entirely. The county clerk dismissed it with a formality that Crane described as almost contemptuous, and Elvira received confirmation in writing that her deed was clear and uncontested. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, and then went outside and stood in her yard in the October sunshine, and looked at her land, the fields and the spring and the cottonwoods and the barn with its sound roof, and she felt something complete itself inside her that she had been building toward since the moment she had ridden into Dusty Creek. She rode to Martin's that afternoon, and found him in the south pasture checking on a heifer that was near her time. He looked up when she rode toward him, reading her face the way he had learned to do. "Good news," he said. She held up the letter. "The challenge has been dismissed," she said. "The deed is clear. The land is mine." He came to her horse and took her hand and held it and looked up at her with a joy that was clean and uncomplicated and wholly for her. "I knew it would come," he said. "You did everything right." She folded the letter and tucked it back in her pocket. "Drummond is not done," she said practically. "Not entirely." "No," Martin agreed. "But the land office inquiry is going to limit him considerably, and the county is watching him now." He paused. "Rosa told me that Grady Walsh filed his own complaint last week. Between you and Walsh and the Pina affidavit, Drummond is going to find this valley considerably less comfortable than it used to be." The truth of that was borne out over the following months. Drummond, faced with an official inquiry and a newly solidified coalition of neighboring landowners, began to pull back. He was not a man who admitted defeat, but he was a man who understood when the odds had shifted against him, and he redirected his expansion efforts north, toward less organized territory, and left Dusty Creek's smaller ranchers alone. It was not justice in the fullest sense. It was the particular partial justice that the frontier offered, which was better than nothing and more than many people got. Martin proposed to Elvira on a cold, clear December evening on the front porch of the farmhouse, standing in the last light of a sunset that had turned the sky every color from pink to deep purple, with the first stars beginning to show over the eastern hills. He was direct about it, as he was direct about everything, and there was no theatrical stagecraft to it except the beauty of the evening itself. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build something with you. I know you have worked hard to build this on your own, and I am not asking you to give that up. I am asking you to let me be part of it, to let what you have built and what I have built become something together." He paused. "I love you, Elvira, very much." She looked at him for a moment in the evening light, this man who had shown up consistently and honestly for 9 months, who had helped without taking over and listened without advising when she had not asked and cared for her without making her less herself. This man who made her laugh and who understood her stubbornness, and who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He pulled her close and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch as the stars came out over the Texas night, warm together against the cold air. They were married in January of 1879 at the church in Dusty Creek that leaned slightly to the left. Ruth Galloway stood with Elvira, and Tamaz stood with Martin and Rosa Pina, and her children filled the front 2 rows and wept with an enthusiasm that Elvira found deeply touching. Herbert Crane was there, looking proud, and Grady Walsh came in from the west with his wife and a bottle of very old whiskey as a gift. The ceremony was simple and meaningful, and the pastor, a good-natured man named Fletcher who had seen a great deal of life, spoke about the kind of love that was built from shared labor and shared risk and the willingness to see another person clearly. Elvira wore a dress that Rosa had helped her make from deep green wool, because it was January, and because she had never particularly cared for white, and Martin wore his cleanest shirt and a jacket that he had ordered from a catalog, and that fit him unexpectedly well. When the pastor asked if she took this man, she said yes with the same steadiness with which she said everything, and Martin's hand holding hers tightened slightly, and she felt that specific happiness that is different from excitement, quieter and surer and deeper. After the wedding, they discussed at length the question of properties. Elvira's land and Martin's land were 4 miles apart, which was manageable but not ideal for a working marriage. They decided to use both, running cattle across the combined acreage under a single operation but maintaining both farmhouses, the Becker farmhouse as a summer place and working base for the eastern fields, and Martin's ranch house as the primary home. This arrangement made practical sense and also honored the thing that Elvira had built on her own, which Martin had always understood was important to her. They moved her furniture and her books and her tin box and her chickens and her cattle to Martin's ranch in the first week of February, and Elvira stood in the kitchen of the ranch house, the window over the sink looking out onto the east pasture, and felt it become hers in the simple and complete way of belonging. She kept the deed to the Becker property in the tin box alongside the wedding certificate and the letter from the Fort Worth land office, because those 3 pieces of paper represented the 3 things she was most proud of in her life up to that point, though she understood that the list was likely to grow. The spring of 1879 was the best they had seen in 3 years, with enough rain to fill the spring properly and bring the grass up thick and early. Martin and Elvira worked the ranch together with an ease that surprised even them, not because the work was easy, but because they fit each other's working rhythm in a way that reduced friction rather than creating it. She had opinions about the cattle management, and he listened to them, incorporating the ones that made sense and arguing against the ones he disagreed with, and she argued back, and they were both better ranchers for it. Rosa came to stay for a week in April when she was fighting a fever that left her worn and weak, and Elvira nursed her back to health with the competent practicality of a woman who had read every medical book her father owned, and who did not panic easily. Martin went over to the Pina Ranch every other morning that week to check on the children and the animals and to carry back reports that comforted Rosa, and she watched him from her sick bed and told Elvira, in a voice still rough from fever, that he was a very good man and that Elvira had done well. "I know," Elvira said, smiling at her friend from across the room. By summer, Elvira knew that she was expecting their first child. She told Martin on a June evening after supper, sitting across the kitchen table in the late light, and watched his face move through surprise and joy and something so tender she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands and pressed them to his lips, and she put her hand in his hair and felt the depth of her love for him like a physical weight in her chest, enormous and real and entirely welcome. "Are you well?" he asked, looking up at her with those steady brown eyes. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Do not start treating me like I am breakable. I will not allow it," he laughed. "I would not dare." "Good," she said, and kissed him. She was, in fact, well throughout the pregnancy. She slowed down on the heavier physical work by necessity and without too much resentment, and she found ways to redirect her energy into the accounts and the correspondence and the management of the eastern fields, which she ran with a hand that had become increasingly experienced and assured. She visited the Becker farmhouse regularly, checking on the fields and the condition of the building, and she spent time planning what she wanted to plant in the eastern fields the following spring. She also, during those quieter months, taught herself more thoroughly to read surveying maps, which she had been meaning to do for a year, using a set of maps borrowed from Herbert Crane and a surveying manual that Martin had in his collection. This was not entirely without practical purpose, as the boundaries between their combined property and Drummond's reduced but still substantial land to the north needed periodic verification. But it was also simply the satisfaction of learning, something difficult and genuinely useful. Martin watched her do this with an expression of affection and amusement that she found occasionally insufferable and mostly endearing. "You cannot stay still," he said one evening. "I can stay still perfectly well," she said, not looking up from the map. "I simply choose not to." "That is exactly what I said," he replied mildly, and she threw a pencil at him, and he caught it without looking. Their son was born in February of 1880, a healthy, loud, determined little person who arrived on a cold morning with a north wind driving snow against the windows, and who came into the world apparently highly motivated to make his presence known. Rosa was there, having ridden over through the early snow with enviable determination, and she helped Elvira through the labor with the practical competence of a woman who had done this herself, and who knew that the greatest gift was calmness and information rather than drama. Martin was in the house, which was unusual for the time and which he had insisted on, staying in the front room and being visibly useless while remaining committed to the principle of being nearby. When Rosa brought him in after it was done and held out his son, Elvira watched his face and thought she had never seen him look so entirely undone in the best possible way. He named the boy after his uncle, the one who had brought him west, and Elvira agreed to James as a first name and added Patrick as a middle name for her father. James Patrick Rhodes was 2 days old when Martin held him in the kitchen in the early morning, the sun coming through the east window, and told him in a low voice about the land outside, about the cattle and the spring and the hills, and Elvira sat in the doorway and listened, and thought that this was what she had come to Texas to find, not the land itself but this, the specific weight of belonging to something real. The years that followed were full of the kind of life that is too busy for nostalgia while it is happening and becomes precious in the remembering. Their combined operation grew steadily and honestly, taking on 2 more hands by 1881, building a second barn on the eastern property, expanding the cattle herd to a size that gave them a comfortable and genuine standing in the cattle market that ran through the county each fall. Drummond sold his northern operation in 1882 and moved south, and the land office inquiry that Elvira had helped initiate was cited as a contributing factor in making the county inhospitable to the kind of consolidation practices he had favored. The land he left behind was sold to a family named McAllister who came up from San Antonio with 4 sons, and a philosophy about neighbor relations that was refreshingly different from what had preceded them. The Pina Ranch stabilized and eventually thrived. Rosa's eldest son, who was 15 by 1882, turned out to have an extraordinary instinct for cattle, and by the time he was grown, the Pina operation was one of the more respected in the county. Elvira watched Rosa watch her children grow into capable people, and recognized in her friend's quiet satisfaction the same thing she felt looking at her own life, the deep contentment of having built something that would outlast you. James was 3 when Elvira told Martin they were expecting again. He received this news with less surprise and equal joy, holding her in the kitchen after supper with his chin on top of her head and the evening quiet around them. "This time I would like a girl," he said. "You do not get to choose," she said. "I know," he said. "I am simply expressing a preference." Their second child was a boy, born in the spring of 1883, and they named him William after Martin's father, who had come out from Tennessee to see his first grandchildren and who stayed for 3 months, and proved to be unexpectedly useful with the cattle and deeply delighted by his grandchildren. Martin's mother came with him, and she and Elvira liked each other immediately and genuinely, 2 practical women with a great deal to discuss. Martin's parents returned to Tennessee with the promise to come again, and they did, and those visits became a cherished part of the rhythm of their years. Ruth Galloway retired from the general store in 1884 and sold it to a young couple from Ohio, but she continued to live in Dusty Creek and to be a source of information and occasional sharp observation that Elvira had come to regard as one of the genuine pleasures of life in the valley. She came to supper at the ranch once a month and ate with her usual efficient appreciation, and told the children stories about the early days of Dusty Creek that were edited for their ages but still contained enough truth to be genuinely educational. The town itself grew over those years in the way of frontier towns when the violence settles and the commerce takes hold. A proper school was established in 1882, and Elvira was instrumental in the founding of it, donating time and a considerable quantity of organizational energy, and several boxes of books from her father's collection, which she had finally shipped from Missouri. The teacher they hired was a young woman named Alice Bright from Virginia, who reminded Elvira slightly of herself at that age, competent and direct, and a little lonely in the new country. And Elvira made a point of inviting her to supper and introducing her to the valley's social life with the same practicality with which Ruth had once helped her. Martin turned 40 in 1887, and Elvira and Rosa and Ruth conspired to produce a celebration at the ranch house that managed to both surprise him and contain most of the people in the valley that he cared about. He stood in the yard of his ranch in the October evening with his 2 sons beside him and his wife laughing at his expression, and looked around at the assembled people who had become his life and seemed, for once, entirely at a loss for words. James was 7 by then, and William was 4, and they both had their father's steadiness and their mother's directness, which produced a combination that was simultaneously admirable and exhausting. James had started at the school and was proving to be methodical and serious about his learning in a way that filled Elvira with a particular happiness, because her father had believed that learning was the thing that could not be taken from you, and she had believed it too, and now she was watching it take root in the next generation. On the night of Martin's birthday, after the guests had gone and the boys were in bed, Elvira and Martin sat on the porch in the cold October air wrapped in a blanket together, the way they had taken to doing on evenings when the work was done and the house was quiet, and Martin put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the stars were out in enormous quantity over the Texas dark, which never stopped being remarkable. "Are you happy?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking about something seriously. "I am the happiest man in Texas," he said, "possibly in the country. I am not sure how to properly account for what my life has become." She looked up at him. His face in the starlight was older than it had been when she rode into Dusty Creek, the lines a little deeper, the hair touched with gray at the temples, and she thought he was the most beautiful person she had ever known and that she would think so until there was no thinking left in her. "I came here with a deed and $20 and a completely unreasonable amount of stubbornness," she said. "And a derringer in your boot," he said. She laughed. "How do you know about that?" Ruth told me, he said, the first day you came to town. She shook her head. Of course she did. She was quiet for a moment. I did not come here looking for you. I want you to know that. I came here because it was the only thing I had, a piece of land I had never seen. And then everything that happened, and you were part of it from the beginning, and now I cannot imagine what any of it would have been without you. He pressed his lips to her temple, and she felt the warmth of it to her bones. Neither can I, he said. They sat in the blanket together until the cold drove them inside, and the house was warm and full of the particular quiet that comes to a house where children sleep safely. And the land outside was theirs and had been for almost a decade, and would be for as long as they worked it and beyond. The following spring, Elvira planted a stand of cottonwood saplings along the north fence line of the Becker property, which she had begun to think of as the East Field rather than the Becker property, because it was not Horace Becker's anymore and had not been for some time. She planted them on a March morning with James beside her, teaching him how to set the roots properly and tamp the earth firmly, and how far apart trees needed to be to have room to grow into what they were meant to be. James listened with his father's serious attention and his mother's critical questions, and he planted 3 of the saplings himself with the careful intentionality of a child who has been raised to understand that living things require patience and deserve respect. They will not be big for a long time, he said, looking at the row of small, hopeful sticks in the ground. No, Elvira agreed. Will we see them big? She looked along the fence line, imagining the trees 10 years from now, 20, the way they would mark the property boundary in a living green line that you could see from a distance. Some of them, she said, and the boys and girls who come after us will see the rest. James considered this with the philosophical gravity of a 7-year-old who was actually thinking about it rather than just hearing words. That is a good reason to plant them, he said finally. Elvira smiled at her son and handed him the next sapling. I thought so too, she said. She looked east down the fence line at the land she had come to on horseback with nothing but stubbornness and a deed and $20. And she thought of the morning she had first walked its acres, and decided she was going to make something of it. And she thought of the afternoon she had ridden to Martin's ranch, and sat at his kitchen table, and begun the longest conversation of her life, one that had never really stopped. Martin rode over from the main house at mid-morning, as she had known he would, because he had a way of showing up when she was at the East Field that she had long since stopped being surprised by. He dismounted and came to the fence line and looked at the row of saplings and then at her and at James, who was carefully digging a hole for the next one with his small shovel. Nice line, Martin said. Thank you, Elvira said. He stood beside her at the fence and looked out at the land and the sky, and the wind moved through the young grass with that particular sound that never got old. And in the distance the spring was running with the snowmelt from the hills, and the cottonwoods along it were coming into their first green. There is nowhere I would rather be, he said, and she knew he did not mean the East Field. She reached out and took his hand without looking at him, and he held hers firmly in the way he always did, and James looked up from his hole and said, with the frank practicality of a child who has absorbed his parents' approach to things, "Are you going to help or just stand there?" Martin laughed, and Elvira laughed, and he came through the fence gate to help his son dig holes for the trees that would take years to grow and would outlast them all. And the Texas spring moved around them, enormous and clear and full of the particular grace of a life built well from difficult beginnings. By 1890, Dusty Creek had grown into a proper small town with 2 churches, a school that employed 3 teachers, a doctor who had arrived in 1886 and who Rosa had immediately enlisted into her campaign to improve the medical care available to the valley's residents, a working telegraph office, and a hotel that was separate from the saloon. The land in the valley was well established and well worked, with several prosperous family operations that had taken root in the years since the worst of the consolidation pressure had ended. Martin and Elvira's ranch had grown into one of the larger operations in the county, run with the combination of Martin's instinct for cattle and Elvira's talent for organization and long-range planning. They had added a second foreman by 1888, a quiet, capable man named Samuel, who had come up from the South looking for steady work, and who turned out to be one of the best judges of cattle health Martin had ever encountered. They ran 500 head across the combined acreage and had a reliable contract with a buyer in Fort Worth that gave them a stable market each fall. James turned 10 in 1890 and was reading at a level that would have satisfied Elvira's father entirely. William turned 7 and had inherited his father's ease with animals and spent most of his free hours in the barn or the pasture, communing with the horses in a way that was slightly mysterious to everyone around him and wholly effective. Their third child arrived in the fall of 1890, a daughter, born on an October night with the harvest moon enormous and orange in the east window, and they named her Frances after Martin's mother, who received the news in a letter and wrote back in a hand that shook slightly with happiness. Frances turned out to have a combination of her mother's directness and her father's steadiness that produced a small person of extremely definite opinions, who was also, somehow, consistently charming in the execution of them. Martin watched her at 3 months sitting on Elvira's lap and staring at him with those wide gray-green eyes, and said with total certainty that they were in a great deal of trouble, and he said it with the specific joy of a man who finds the trouble entirely welcome. The family that Elvira had built from nothing, from the single thread of a deed to a neglected property and the choice to show up and do the work, was real and full and whole. The land was sound, and the house was warm, and the children were growing into themselves with the kind of grounded confidence that comes from being genuinely loved, and from watching their parents love each other consistently and honestly. There were still hard years, because the land was still the land, and the Texas weather still had its opinions, and the cattle market still had its swings, and life in the frontier still required the kind of stubborn daily commitment that never entirely became easy. In 1892, a drought came and lasted through the summer, and they lost a portion of the herd and had to manage carefully through the winter on reduced income. And there were conversations at the kitchen table by lamplight that were serious and honest and sometimes worried. But they navigated it together, as they navigated everything, with the particular quality that had been between them from the beginning, two practical people who respected each other's capability and did not diminish their shared difficulties by pretending they were smaller than they were. They came through the drought year leaner than before and intact, and in the spring of 1893, the rain returned and the grass came back and the rebuilt herd was strong, and they stood in the east field on a May morning in the growing warmth and looked at the land and felt the specific gratitude of people who have been tested and have held. The cottonwoods along the north fence line of the east field were, by 1893, actual trees. Not enormous, not yet, but genuinely trees, tall enough to shade a person standing beneath them, with the gray-green leaves trembling in the breeze in that particular way of cottonwoods, which have always known something about endurance that other trees are still learning. Elvira walked the fence line on a June morning in 1893, 15 years after she had ridden into Dusty Creek with a carpetbag and a deed and an unreasonable quantity of stubbornness, and looked at the trees she had planted with James, and thought about all the things that had grown from that first season of difficult decisions and hard work. The land, the house, the life. The man who had been part of it from the first weeks, who was at this moment on the other side of the ranch, probably arguing pleasantly with Samuel about the best rotation for the south pasture. She was 39 years old, and she was standing on land that was entirely hers, that she had defended and worked and built into something lasting, beside trees that she had planted with her own hands, in a life that had exceeded every hope she had brought to Texas in that spring of 1878. She walked back across the field through the warm June morning, through the grass that was as thick and green as it had been that first day she had walked these acres, past the spring where the water ran clear over clean stones, past the mended fence that had been cut and rebuilt and stood firm, toward the main road that led back to Martin's ranch, which was her ranch, her home, her life. She found him exactly where she expected him, at the south pasture gate with Samuel, the two of them gesturing at the far field in the way men gesture at things they have been discussing for some time without resolving. Martin turned when he heard her horse, and his face did the thing it had always done when he saw her, the thing she had never been able to properly describe, except to say that it made her feel like she was the best thing in his field of vision. "How are the trees?" he asked. "Magnificent," she said. He smiled. Samuel looked at both of them with the tolerant expression of a man who has worked for this couple for 5 years and has made peace with the fact that they are periodically going to be like this. Elvira dismounted and came to stand beside Martin at the fence, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they looked out at the south pasture together, the cattle moving slowly in the late morning heat, the grass rich and full, the sky as enormous and blue as it had been the first day she had arrived in Texas, when she had ridden into a small leaning town with nothing but stubbornness and a deed and $20 and an idea about what she wanted her life to be. She had been right about what she wanted. She had not been right about what would make it possible. She had thought she needed to do it alone. She had been wrong about that, and she was grateful every single day for having been wrong. She thought of Rosa, who was coming to supper on Sunday with her eldest son and his new wife, bringing a pot of something that smelled better than anything Elvira could produce from her own kitchen. She thought of Ruth Galloway, who was 70 and still sharp, and still found occasion to provide pointed observations about the state of things. She thought of James at 13, his nose in a book that had nothing to do with ranching and everything to do with engineering, which he had decided was his future with the absolute certainty of a boy who knew his own mind. She thought of William and his horses and Frances with her definite opinions. She thought of her father, who had taught her to write letters to lonely old men and to read surveying maps and to believe that no skill was beneath a person's attention, and she thought that she hoped he knew, wherever knowing happened, that his daughter had been all right. She thought of the deed in the tin box and the letter from the land office and the wedding certificate, and the space that had grown up around those 3 documents over the years, all the receipts and contracts and accounts and letters that represented a life built honestly in difficult country. Martin's arm tightened slightly around her and she looked up at him and found him looking at her with the same expression he had been looking at her with for 15 years, steady and warm and entirely certain. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "How it all started, how it has come out." "Good thoughts," he said. She looked out at the land again, at her land, at their land, at the cattle and the grass and the wide blue sky and the hills beyond, and the road that ran through Dusty Creek and the valley that she had come to with nothing and had made into home. "The best," she said. The June morning moved around them in the Texas way, generous and enormous and full of light, and Martin held her beside the fence of their south pasture, while their children were somewhere in the house and the barn and the books, growing into the people they would become on this land, this foundation. And the valley was as beautiful as it had always been, and they were where they had always been trying to get, together and home, and at peace with the distance they had come.